white, the sweet, and it's sitting in almost every kitchen on Earth right now. But this small, ordinary crystal has a history soaked in blood. It built empires and burned them down. It funded wars, powered the Industrial Revolution, and became the single greatest driver of the largest forced migration in human history, the Transatlantic Slave Trade.
Advance! Push them back into the river!
Millions of human beings were kidnapped, shipped across oceans, and worked to death for it. They called it white gold. We call it sugar. Tonight, we're going to trace this crystal from a wild grass on a remote Pacific island to the plantations of the Caribbean, to the coffee cup sitting on your table right now. This is the story of how something so sweet became one of the most destructive commodities in human history. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at a spoonful of sugar the same way again. Our story doesn't begin in a factory or a palace or a trading port. It begins on the island of New Guinea, in the South Pacific, roughly 8,000 years ago. There, in the dense, humid jungle, grew a tall, fibrous grass called Saccharum officinarum, what we know today as sugarcane. The people of New Guinea discovered that if you cut the thick stalks and chewed on them, a sweet juice flooded your mouth. It wasn't sugar as we know it. No crystals, no granules, just cane, chewed raw, prized as a treat and used in rituals and ceremonies. For thousands of years, that's all sugar was. A wild plant, chewed for pleasure, passed from island to island by traders and migrating farmers. Slowly, it spread west into Southeast Asia, into the Philippines, into India. And it was in India, sometime around 500 BCE, that everything changed. Indian chemists and farmers discovered something remarkable. If you crushed the cane, boiled down the juice, and let it dry, it left behind hard, granulated crystals. Something that could be stored, transported, traded. They called it sarkara, the Sanskrit word for gravel or grit. It's the root of the word we still use today, sugar. For the first time in history, sugar wasn't just a plant. It was a product. By the time of the Persian Empire, sugar had become a prized commodity, so rare and so valuable that it was nicknamed sweet salt. Persian engineers built the first refineries, developing techniques to purify the crystals into a paler, sweeter product. Then, in the 7th century, the rise of Islam changed sugar's fate forever. As Islamic armies and traders expanded across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain, they carried sugarcane cultivation with them. Muslim engineers built sophisticated irrigation systems specifically designed for sugarcane, which is an incredibly thirsty crop. It demands huge amounts of water, intense heat, and rich soil. Wherever the Islamic world went, sugar plantations followed, in Egypt, in Cyprus, in Sicily, in southern Spain. By the 10th century, sugar had become an essential part of Islamic medicine, cuisine, and trade. Arab traders introduced it to Venetian merchants, who began importing it into Europe as an extraordinary luxury. Sold not in grocery stores, but in apothecaries alongside medicines and spices.
Your precious sugar, my lord.
For medieval Europeans, sugar wasn't food. It was medicine. It was a status symbol. It was reserved almost exclusively for royalty, nobility, and the church. But that was about to change. And it would change because of holy war. When European crusaders marched into the Holy Land in the 11th and 12th centuries, they encountered something they had never tasted before: sugarcane fields and the refined white crystals produced from them. Soldiers returning home told stories of this incredible, sweet salt, and European nobility became obsessed. Demand exploded. Venice, with its trading networks into the Middle East, became Europe's sugar capital, and Venetian merchants made staggering fortunes importing the crystal to European courts. But there was a problem. Sugarcane cannot grow in Europe's cold, temperate climate. It needs heat. It needs humidity. It needs year-round warmth. Europe had none of that. So European monarchs began looking outward, searching for new land in warmer climates where sugarcane could be grown on a massive scale, far from the deserts of the Middle East and closer to home. Portugal found the answer first, and it would change the world forever. In the early 1400s, Portuguese sailors discovered a set of uninhabited volcanic islands off the coast of Africa, Madeira, and shortly after, the Canary Islands. The climate was perfect. Warm, humid, fertile volcanic soil. Prince Henry the Navigator, the man who launched Portugal's age of exploration, ordered sugarcane to be planted there almost immediately. But sugarcane isn't just demanding on land. It's demanding on labor. Harvesting cane is brutal, backbreaking work, done in extreme heat, using machete-like blades, followed by hours of boiling and refining in scorching sugar mills. Free laborers were expensive and few wanted the job. So the Portuguese made a decision that would set the template for the next 4 centuries. They began using enslaved labor, first from North Africa, then increasingly from West Africa, as Portuguese ships began sailing further down the African coast. Madeira became the world's first major sugar plantation colony, and the first place where enslaved African labor was combined with European capital on a mass commercial scale, purely to produce a luxury commodity. It was a small operation compared to what was coming, but it was the blueprint: land, cane, capital, and enslaved human beings. Every single element of the system that would soon devastate an ocean was already in place, decades before Columbus ever set sail. In 1493, on his second voyage across the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus carried something with him that would prove far more consequential than gold: sugarcane cuttings, taken from the Canary Islands. He planted them in the soil of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The cane thrived. The Caribbean climate turned out to be even more perfect for sugar than the Canary Islands had been. Hotter, wetter, with a longer growing season. Spanish and later Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch colonizers realized they had stumbled onto something extraordinary: an entire hemisphere capable of producing unlimited sugar for a Europe that was becoming more and more addicted to it by the year. There was just one problem from the colonizers' cold, calculating point of view: labor. The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, the Taino, the Arawak, were forced into slavery to work the new plantations. But European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, combined with brutal treatment and overwork, devastated indigenous populations at a horrifying scale. Within a few decades, entire populations that had lived on these islands for thousands of years were nearly wiped out. The plantation owners needed a new labor source, and they turned to the coast of West Africa. This is the moment the modern world holds its breath, because what happened next would become the single largest forced migration in human history, and sugar was the primary reason it happened. Portugal's colony of Brazil, established in the early 1500s, became the first true sugar superpower. Its coastline was ideal for massive plantations called engenhos. By the late 1500s, Brazil was producing more sugar than the rest of the world combined, and virtually all of it was harvested by enslaved Africans, transported directly across the Atlantic in the holds of Portuguese slave ships. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, more enslaved Africans were sent to Brazil than to any other place in the Americas, over 4 million people. And Brazil was only the beginning, as other European powers, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, carved up the Caribbean into competing sugar colonies. The demand for enslaved labor exploded across the entire region. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Cuba, each island became a sugar factory, and each sugar factory needed thousands upon thousands of enslaved human beings to run it. Historians estimate that of the roughly 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic during the entire slave trade, a staggering majority were sent specifically to work sugar plantations. Not cotton, not tobacco, sugar. Sugar remains, by every historical measure, the single deadliest cash crop in human history, measured in human lives. To understand why sugar was so uniquely deadly, you have to understand what growing it actually required. Sugarcane must be cut by hand, at the exact moment it ripens, then rushed to the mill and processed within hours, before the sugar content starts to degrade. This created a production system unlike almost any other form of agricultural slavery. An unrelenting, around-the-clock cycle during harvest season, sometimes running 18 to 20 hours a day, for weeks without rest. Workers operated massive crushing rollers and boiling cauldrons of molten cane syrup, heated over open flame in sweltering, boiling houses that could reach temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius. Injuries were horrific and constant. limbs caught in rollers, bodies burned by boiling syrup. Some plantations kept a hatchet beside the rollers, specifically to amputate a limb quickly if a worker got caught, in a grim attempt to save their life so they could keep working. Mortality rates on Caribbean sugar plantations were catastrophic. On many islands, enslaved laborers died faster than children were born into slavery, meaning plantation owners had to continuously import new enslaved people from Africa simply to maintain their workforce. Historians estimate the average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation, after arrival, was as low as 7 to 10 years. This was not incidental brutality. It was calculated economics. Enslavers ran the numbers and, unthinkably, often concluded it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than to keep them alive long-term. Sugar didn't just enslave people, consumed them. By the 1600s and 1700s, sugar had become so profitable that European powers were willing to go to actual war over small Caribbean islands. Consider this: in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, France was offered a choice by Britain in the peace negotiations. France could keep either all of Canada or the tiny sugar island of Guadeloupe. France chose Guadeloupe. That decision alone tells you everything about how valuable sugar had become. A sugar island smaller than the state of Rhode Island was considered, by the French crown, more valuable than the entire territory of Canada. Britain's most prized possession wasn't its North American colonies either. It was Jamaica and Barbados. The wealth flowing out of these small islands, in the form of sugar and rum, dwarfed the profits from tobacco and cotton combined for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. Fortunes made from Caribbean sugar built entire cities in Europe. Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, and Bordeaux all expanded dramatically on the back of sugar and slave trading profits. Grand estates across the English countryside, some of which still stand today as museums and heritage sites, were financed almost entirely by Caribbean sugar wealth. The British referred to their sugar islands as the jewels in the crown of the entire empire. Not India, not yet. Sugar came first. Sugar didn't just create one commodity. It created an entire economic engine known today as the Triangular Trade. European ships set sail loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, tools, bound for the west coast of Africa. There, these goods were traded for enslaved human beings. Those ships then crossed the Atlantic on the infamous Middle Passage, a journey of unimaginable horror, where enslaved Africans were crammed below deck in chains, with mortality rates during the crossing reaching as high as 15 to 20% on some voyages. Upon reaching the Caribbean or Brazil, enslaved people were sold to plantation owners. And the ships didn't return to Europe empty. They loaded up with sugar, molasses, and rum, and sailed back across the Atlantic to complete the triangle. Rum, in particular, became a second fortune built on the back of sugar. Distilled from molasses, a leftover byproduct of sugar refining that was once considered waste, rum became one of the most profitable commodities in the Atlantic world. It fueled taverns across Britain and colonial America. It became currency in the African slave trade itself, with rum directly traded for human beings on the West African coast. By the mid-1700s, the North American colonies alone were distilling millions of gallons of rum every year, almost entirely from Caribbean molasses. In fact, Britain's attempt to tax and control this molasses trade, through laws like the Sugar Act of 1764, became one of the direct sparks that ignited the American Revolution. Sugar didn't just build the Caribbean. It quietly helped shape the birth of the United States. By the late 1700s, one colony stood above all others in sugar wealth: the French colony of Saint-Domingue, on the western third of the island of Hispaniola. Saint-Domingue was, without exaggeration, the most profitable colony on Earth. It alone produced roughly 40% of all the sugar consumed in Europe, along with enormous quantities of coffee. Its enslaved population had swelled to nearly 500,000 people, vastly outnumbering the small population of French colonists and plantation owners who controlled them. In 1791, that imbalance broke. Inspired in part by the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and driven by unbearable brutality, enslaved people across Saint-Domingue rose up in a massive, coordinated rebellion. What followed was over a decade of warfare, led by extraordinary figures like Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved man who became a brilliant military commander and statesman. The revolutionaries defeated the French colonial army. They defeated a Spanish invasion. They defeated a British invasion. And in 1802, they even defeated an enormous force sent by Napoleon Bonaparte himself, one of the greatest military minds in history, who was attempting to reconquer the colony and restore slavery. In 1804, the rebels declared independence. They renamed the colony Haiti, becoming the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to permanently abolish slavery, and the only nation in world history born from a successful, large-scale slave revolution. The economic shockwaves were immediate. Sugar production in Haiti collapsed almost overnight, and global sugar production shifted dramatically to Cuba, Brazil, and other colonies eager to fill the gap. But the message sent to slaveholding societies across the world was unmistakable, and it terrified them. The enslaved could rise up, and they could win. By the early 1800s, a growing moral movement was gaining strength in Britain, and it aimed its focus directly at sugar. Abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce campaigned relentlessly against the slave trade, and one of their most powerful weapons was a consumer boycott, urging ordinary British households to stop buying slave-grown sugar entirely. Pamphlets circulated with a chilling calculation for their era, estimates suggesting that for every few pounds of sugar consumed, a certain measurable fraction of a human life had been lost in its production. Some abolitionist pamphlets even quoted the phrase, "If we buy the produce, we participate in the crime." Hundreds of thousands of British households, remarkably, joined the boycott, refusing sugar in their tea and switching to sugar grown in British India, which did not rely on the same slave labor systems. Britain officially abolished the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery itself throughout the British Empire in 1833, although former slaveholders were compensated financially by the British government for the loss of their property, while the enslaved people themselves received nothing. Other nations followed at different speeds. France abolished slavery in its colonies in 1848. Brazil, tragically, was the very last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, holding out until 1888. By then, the sugar plantation system had directly or indirectly consumed the lives of millions upon millions of people across nearly 4 continents for more than 3 centuries. But abolition did not end the exploitation. It simply changed its name. When slavery ended, plantation owners across the Caribbean, Mauritius, Fiji, and other sugar colonies faced a crisis. Who would now cut the cane? Their answer was a new system, one designed to closely resemble slavery in practice while technically being legal under new abolition laws: indentured servitude. Beginning in the mid-1800s, European colonial powers, particularly Britain, began recruiting and often deceiving hundreds of thousands of impoverished workers from India and China. These workers were promised paid contracts, usually 5 to 10 years, transportation to distant colonies, and eventual freedom or return passage. In reality, indentured laborers frequently faced conditions nearly identical to those of the enslaved people they replaced. Brutal working hours, minimal pay, physical punishment, and contracts extended indefinitely through manufactured debt. Between 1834 and the early 1900s, an estimated 1.3 million indentured laborers from India alone were transported to sugar colonies across the British Empire, to Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, and South Africa. This is why, today, you'll find large populations of Indian and Chinese descent living in Caribbean nations and Pacific islands thousands of miles from their ancestral homelands. A direct, living legacy of sugar's insatiable demand for cheap, controllable labor, generations after slavery officially ended. The crop had changed the ethnic makeup of entire regions of the planet, and it still wasn't finished reshaping the world. Back in Europe, a completely different sugar revolution was quietly unfolding, one that had nothing to do with the tropics at all. In 1747, a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf discovered that sugar could be extracted from a humble, cold climate root vegetable, the beet. For decades, this remained a scientific curiosity, far too inefficient to compete with cheap, slave-produced Caribbean cane sugar. That changed because of Napoleon Bonaparte. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain imposed a massive naval blockade on French-controlled Europe, cutting France off from Caribbean sugar imports almost entirely. Prices in Paris skyrocketed. Napoleon, desperate for a domestic alternative, poured government funding into sugar beet research, and ordered tens of thousands of acres across France to be planted with beets instead of traditional crops. The industry that emerged from Napoleon's wartime desperation never went away. By the mid-1800s, sugar beet production had spread across Germany, Russia, and Eastern Europe, creating, for the first time, a major sugar industry that did not depend on tropical colonies or enslaved labor at all. Today, sugar beets account for roughly 20% of the entire world's sugar production, a permanent legacy of one emperor's blockade-driven improvisation. By the 20th century, sugar had completed its transformation, from a rare royal luxury to one of the cheapest, most abundant ingredients on the planet. Industrial refining, global shipping, and government subsidies drove prices down so far that sugar became a base ingredient in an enormous share of all processed food and drink worldwide. The average person today consumes dramatically more sugar than any human being in history. Some estimates suggest modern daily consumption is many times higher than it was just 2 centuries ago. And with that abundance came a new, quieter cost: a global public health crisis. Rising rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease across the world have been directly linked by health researchers to the sheer scale of sugar in modern diets, a slow-motion consequence of an industry built, centuries ago, purely to make sweetness as cheap and available as physically possible, regardless of the toll. The plantations are gone. The chains are gone. But the crop that was purchased with millions of human lives is still, in its own quiet way, extracting a cost from the world today. Sugar built ports and raised islands. It funded revolutions and crushed them. It moved more human beings across the Atlantic Ocean than any other single cause in history. And it did it all for something we now spoon into our coffee without a second thought. The next time you see that small white crystal, remember what it actually cost to make it common. If you found this story as staggering as we did, hit subscribe for more hidden histories like this one, and let us know in the comments which chapter shocked you the most or which chapter should we cover next. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe now to keep a small channel growing. Thank you for watching.